Welcome to Dementia-Friendly Prince George's County, Maryland, Northern Sector webinar series for caregivers. Today's topic is a book review by author Annette Wick. Her book, I'll Have Some of Yours, about what my mother taught me about dementia, cookies, music, the outside, and her life inside a care home. Sponsored by Prince George's County Government and the Department of Family Services.
I've structured this in the same way I might structure a little bit of a storytelling and talking about inciting incidences and the story arc and the plot thickening. So if you happen to hear terms like that, don't panic. This is just part of what I do. And if you want to just go on to the next slide, Natalie. I always start with what I consider the inciting incident. And when you're reading a novel, the inciting incident could be a letter that arrives in the mail. It could be a stranger showing up on the front door, or sometimes it's a dead body if you're talking about murder mysteries. But in this case, the inciting incident was a phone call for me. And I live in Southern Ohio in Cincinnati. My parents were living in Northern Ohio at the time of this phone call, and I had a younger sister living in Northern Ohio as well. And she called me one day. It was a Sunday brunch. I distinctly remember that. And I was out with my family, and we happened to be walking around the park after a brunch. And she said, "Mom isn't bathing, and also Mom's not cooking." Well, I thought this was kind of strange at the time because this was not a new situation. We had seen slowly over time that my mom was leaving some of her everyday sort of activities undone. And my father had also seen it coming. And I lived 4 hours away by car. And I just wondered, what did my sister expect me to do from the distance at which I was living away from them? Next slide. So there's always a setup in every story, right? Where you go back and talk about what's been going on. How did we get to this point? So there were a lot of expectations I had at that stage of my life, and I was about 45 at this particular time, but there were expectations I had of my parents, and that they would just live a long life and a happy life. There were expectations that my siblings, I was one of 5 children, 2 lived near my parents. One of them might certainly be able to help out with my parents as they aged, and I could help in between. I was working as a writer. I was teaching writing classes, and of course I had a bit of a flexible schedule, but not enough so that like anybody else, that you wanted to just pick up and leave your entire life behind. And then there were the expectations I had that were my own expectations, internal expectations, that my mother would still be mom to me, and she would always be there, right? There would just always be time for her to have these motherly chats with, or for us to bake cookies together with. And finally, there were expectations that I had around her. And I'm going to read this piece here from I'll Have Some of Yours. This is part of the introduction. I grew up in a boisterous and moody Italian household where my mother executed banquets of rolled antipasti, fresh ravioli, wedding soup, and trays of Italian cookies with the precision of a 5-star restaurant chef. Leftovers were prized possessions. If I crept into the kitchen late at night, made a sandwich with crusty Italian bread from a cousin's bakery, and layered it with capicola, prosciutto, and the hard kind of provolone that caused my teeth to tingle, the rattling of silverware in the drawer beckoned my mother from her chair as she dozed in the nearby family room. She didn't plan to miss out on enjoying all the remnants of her hard work. "Oh boy, that looks good," she said. Her brown eyes, as circular as her round face, grew into huge ovals as she surveyed my sandwich piled high. I asked if she wanted me to fix her something too. Slyly and smartly, she said, "No thanks, I'll have some of yours." Back then, I thought "I'll have some of yours" was my mother's way of saying, "Tired. I did all the work. Now I'll just borrow from you and have some of what's on your plate." But she wasn't just talking about the sandwich when she said that line. As my mother fried Canadian bacon during the Sunday brunch feast she cooked for my visiting college roommates, listened to me gripe about why my high school English teacher didn't like my work, held my words in letters I wrote home when my 38-year-old husband was diagnosed with cancer, or baked and brought cookies to my young teething son, she meant, "I'll take some of that burden off of you and put it on me." Then dementia took a seat beside me at my mother's cherished oval table. The mother who gave birth to me after my father drove to the hospital in a blinding January snowstorm was no longer the woman in front of me. As her caregiver, I daily swooped into her care home, and we leisurely walked along the corridors or lingered outside in the courtyard. Yet there were also times I found myself rushing to the ER of a hospital, my heart banging, determined to do anything to hold on to her physically. I was her bodyguard and her safety net. If I could protect her from a fall by making her walk more or keeping her from contracting the flu, she wouldn't lose more of her memory, and I could keep alive the mother who had given me life and loved me as her daughter. And I could protect myself from feeling her loss, or so I hoped. I know this now. When I stopped changing what I thought should be changed, combing my mother's hair constantly, making her bed perfectly, neatly rearranging her clothes in the closet after the staff washed them, and was quiet enough to listen to her breathe, I relieved her of my expectation to still be mom to me. I could enjoy her as a woman who no longer knew my name, but knew she loved me and wanted to press her head into the crook of my neck as we sat in the sun together or shared food from a single dish. So the last bullet point I have on that slide is really about societal expectations too, and that especially for women that are in the audience, it does tend to fall on the daughter, the daughter-in-law, the granddaughters as caregivers, and or possibly those who others don't feel are working in a full-time capacity. My situation just happened to allow me a lot of flexibility, but that doesn't mean I wasn't working full-time. So, next slide. As I said, I'm the middle daughter of 5 children, and when I was in my late 20s, I moved from Ohio out to Oregon with my young husband, and we had a son named Davis, and we enjoyed family life for a good year until he was diagnosed. My husband was diagnosed with leukemia, and for 3 years, he battled cancer courageously. Um, we tried to be a family during that period of time, but we also knew that we had to come back to Ohio in order to really take advantage of the support network that we had. And it was the first time in which I experienced what it meant to be a caregiver. And I have a lot of lessons from that that I was able to carry forth into my caregiving for my mom. But one in particular that I'm going to share a little bit later as we wrap up. But back to the time period in which I was caring for my husband. One of the things you learn pretty early on is how to be an advocate and how to be a voice for somebody else, and how that would certainly translate later on for somebody who had significant memory loss, only I didn't know that at the time. Um, so my husband died. We're back in Ohio, and I've taken up writing at that point in time. I'm teaching writing classes, and I'm also watching my mom and understanding that there's just these little pieces of her that are starting to disappear. And one of the efforts that I made to better understand what she was going through was to begin writing workshops for individuals that had mild to moderate cognitive decline. And these were very in-depth experiences, multi-sensory experiences, even though they just lasted an hour. But a colleague and I were able to elicit a lot of storytelling from this time period with these individuals, and how important it was to us to, in a way, help them free their words, in essence, free their stories, and give them that sense of liberation. And even if it was just in that moment, there was always a shift in the energy of the room that you could feel by the time we wrapped up, that even if they didn't realize or they couldn't articulate exactly all of the activities that we had undertaken that day, they had a sense of, they felt cared for, they felt safe, they felt a sense of goodwill. So let's see. Do you want to move to the next slide, Natalie? Oh, okay. And that was that particular rise in actions that we were just talking about. So maybe we'll skip on to the next one after that. Thanks. So now we've had this rise in action, right? So we know there are things going on with my mom. We can't quite put a handle on it. At times, my mother's family doctor, the old family doctor, thinks that she has thyroid problems. There's other times in which he is so callous as to think that she's just getting old and that she might be giving up. But in the midst of all of this, we upped the stakes once more. And during a visit, my father drove down to Cincinnati with my mom, which was pretty typical during that time because he knew that he could get cared for and that he could get a little bit of a break. If I couldn't get to them, he would drive to me. And so one day they're visiting, and I watch my father's hands begin to tremble. And I think maybe he had too much caffeine. Maybe he's just tired. Once he returns home and gets it checked out, we learn that he has been diagnosed with Parkinson's. And so it was early and it was controllable. But now all of a sudden, there's a lot more at stake. And there's that sense of the expectation of my father is not going to be around or might not be able to take care of my mom. Who's going to take care of my dad? Who's going to take care of my mom? My mom is starting to forget more and more. She's leaving the proverbial pot on the stove boiling, forgetting where she left the keys, any number of those incidences that we can all potentially relate to. And we're starting to realize that mom and dad are going to need a lot more help. Well, one by one, my siblings are disqualified. I have one sister who was in the midst of battling alcoholism. I have a brother who is always at odds with my parents. I have a sister that we used to call no show because on occasion, it was only on occasion that she showed up and showed up on time. And the final sister she was the one that called me back during the inciting incident and said, "Mom's not cooking, mom's not bathing, what should we do?" Finally, the phone calls start coming from my dad. His voice faltered as I picked up the call. "I'm having a hard time, Net Marie, leaving the house with your mother for groceries. She wanders in the store and asks a million questions and wants to leave before we pay." The predicaments continued. "I left the house for my housing authority meeting and she didn't remember where I was. She called the cell phone 8 times. 8 times. He discovered napkins and dishcloths stashed in closets with sweaters and jackets. He couldn't locate the keys to the Chevy Blazer, and your mother doesn't know where she left them." The missing keys were the least of the worries when it came to her driving, but soon she stopped altogether. commanded by a fear far greater than the insurance company. For a while, I kept my mouth shut. My father didn't want to hear my tirade. Puzzled by my silence, his voice dropped in sorrow. Well, Nette Marie, what am I going to do? Your mother is the only one I have left to talk to anymore. Like my mother, my father was also 82. Friends of his were dying at the same pace as the juniper bushes around their home. And she forgets everything I tell her. In that line, the avalanche of 50 years of marriage rumbled down the mountain and landed on my father's heart. I should have just listened, but I couldn't. I wanted to fix things I couldn't see. Dad, what about a support group? Yeah, I've been thinking about one. He sounded confident. I perked up. My father now talked about talking, yet I didn't know what that actually meant. He was silent in a way where his actions showed his love. If he slipped me a $5 bill to stop at Wendy's on my commute back to Cincinnati, it meant, hey, take care of him, take care of yourself. If he drove my car to fill my gas tank while I showered before a long road trip, it meant, I love you. He was an action person, not a feelings one. Me too. Dad, I saw a therapist after Devin died. I never told you, but surely you knew, or heard, or read about it. The joke in our family was that anything in my life had been written in my first published book. My reminding him could help him open up. He had been raised by staunch Catholics, but now slept in the pews during long sermons. Why didn't you just go to church and confession? He asked. Confession wouldn't have been enough, I whispered. I was raised in that same religion, a religion that hadn't saved me from nights of sweat and fears. Confession would never have been enough for me. It wouldn't be for him either. But my father was now talking about talking. Next slide. So according to the AARP, there are 50 million unpaid caregivers in the United States. Most of them are women, and even more so, Black women. I was, as one of 4 daughters in the family, I was the caregiver by default. I would later learn that my father named me as executor, power of attorney of healthcare, and financial power of attorney for both he and my mother, and never asked me once about it. Instead, he had asked all my siblings if he thought he was making the right choice. When we land this role, we're never told how to go about it. We're never told how to do it. We're just told it'll all work out. Or we just presume or hope that it'll all work out. You've heard that, right? I'm sure, it'll all work out the way it's supposed to work out. Well, that's not always true. Next slide. So for a while, I undertook some actions, and then we had a little bit of a lull. And now we've moved my parents, my mom in particular, from their first home of 35 years to a senior living facility. And now my father has had numerous falls. He's in and out of the hospital. He's in and out of skilled care. And finally, he dies. And now we have to move my mom again. And I'm the one left holding the proverbial bag to caregive for my mother. The first place where we have where we've transferred my mom to, there's already trouble brewing. There's a resident there. It's a senior living community. There's a resident there that my mom doesn't like. Jane, I'll call her Jane, doesn't talk. She has a very stoic face. And my mom was a very social person. So she would get mad because Jane wouldn't talk to her, or Jane wouldn't talk back at all. And Jane wouldn't move if my mom wanted her to move over on the couch. And my mom started becoming angrier and angrier with Jane. And one day she hit Jane, and everybody knows what happens. The state gets notified, everyone panics. There's medicating, there's moves, there's a move that must be undertaken. Um, and mind you, my mom, within this time period, has now moved 4 or 5 times. So she's moved from the family home, she's moved to a place with my dad where there's a dementia unit, just as he moves through his, um, in and out of the hospital. And now she's moved again into this particular senior living community that's, again, a memory care unit. So I want to read a little bit about the meaning of finding home. So this is after we've moved mom to, she was in, it's a place called Arden Courts, and perhaps there's some Arden Courts where you are all. I wasn't at her care home in the evenings when my mother, oh, I'm sorry. I think I'm going to start a little bit later from that. But so here we are, my mom is settled into her new place. In the past, I had lobbied for this caregiving duty without fully understanding what lay ahead. I didn't know if I could do it. My mother wasn't always capable of understanding everything I told her. She became easily agitated. That person is fat. Or she'd say, what the hell do you want? She moved toward a place of anger and anxiety. I thought she might get better. Drug companies flooded the market with medications designed to hold on to the last gasp of memory before it died forever. I thought I might get better. Maybe become the respectful, tolerant daughter I mistakenly thought I had been in the past. As a young adult, I had done as I pleased, made my way across the country, figured out which career to pursue, or quit a job altogether without her feedback or consideration. What did she know? I asked back then, as I fought with her to find my own edges. And carelessly, I tossed off her responses. But like any sturdy Italian, my mother trailed me determinedly at every bend. I let her walk at my shadow, in my shadow, never beside me. Now I wanted to ask my mother if my chicken cacciatore had been spiced with the necessary pinch of cayenne pepper, or tell her about one of my children who was struggling. Essentially, I wanted to ask anything and tell her everything she meant to me before she disappeared. And I wanted her to do the same. One morning, I discovered my mother had fallen asleep on top of her bedspread. Uncertain of what mood I might find her in, I had been anxious before my visit. Tired, I now lay down in her twin bed and curled my body around hers. My head rested above hers on a separate pillow, as she now had two. She woke up, turned over, and caressed my face. Etty? She asked, like a child searching for comfort after a storm. Her question surprised me, more so the use of my father's name. She hadn't said his name in several months. It saddened me to hear her ask for him in such an innocent manner. I didn't know if she was asking of my father's whereabouts or if she had been hoping I was him. I didn't know how to answer. Mom, he's not here, I said, and brushed her tangled hair. Oh dear. She rolled back over. He'll be around sometime, I said, and rubbed her back. The words didn't come for me to say he was dead. Often I had yet to accept it myself. Okay. She closed her puffy eyes once more and wiggled her back into my stomach. Her head landed against my heart, and there I let it rest. Next slide, Natalie. My mom lived in her, what was new then, new home then, for nearly 6 years. Time passed slow and fast. People came and went, and the staff came and went. Some of my family members came and went. The holidays came and went. But some things were a constant for her. The home that she lived in was a constant. Her bedroom, her room was a constant. Even her bedspread that I always was so reluctant to change because she recognized it as something she knew from home. And for her, even the outside was a constant. For her to be able to be outside in the fresh air was a constant. And most important, I, as her caregiver, was a constant. And I want to read you this quote that I found in the New York Times, and it was written during the time period of the pandemic. With dementia, a caregiver is kind of the extension of the mind of the patient, said Dr. Jason Karlawish, a co-director of the Penn Memory Center and author of The Problem of Alzheimer's. They fill in where the person with dementia can no longer exercise their moral agency and moral experience. Often a caregiver is an aging spouse who before the pandemic visited her loved one's nursing home every day and stayed for hours, and maybe helped with feeding and bathing when the nursing aides were busy or just because she preferred it that way. Since the start of the pandemic, most family caregivers have been barred from care facilities or hospitals or had their visits severely restricted. The doctor thinks that blanket bans on dementia caregivers were akin to taking away a wheelchair from a person with disabilities. And this is his quote. And that's a brutal metaphor, he said. But all of a sudden, the people who would come and help their minds function were taken away. Some geriatricians describe this separation as unfortunate and damaging, but necessary. Others believe we should have allowed for a gentler nursing home quarantine, one that recognized caregivers as essential parts of dementia healthcare. And it's a really important point I want to impart upon all of you that we are essential to our loved ones, despite the anger and the pain, that we're an essential worker. A phrase that came up obviously throughout the pandemic, but we are so more than anyone else other than, say, the staff at my mother's care home. They too, who became an extension, like through the bonding that they all did together. But I do think, like I said, it's important to remember that we're essential to them. Natalie, next slide. So I want to go back to that notion of constancy and talking about how time passes, right? So it's been said that there's 3 stages of time. There's ordinary time, and ordinary time is eating, drinking, bathing, walking outside, whatever passed were my mother's daily activities. And if it was going to music class or, participating in a session where they were making cookies, that's all very ordinary times. And then there are tragic times. And my mother had a lot of tragic times. There were UTIs, there were many strokes, there were incidences. There was one incident in particular in which she took a bite out of a bar of soap, and I still have that bar of soap. I keep it just as a reminder that my mother survived through that, but she was up against a near emergency tracheotomy, and I would have had to make a decision on the orders that I was originally given as her power of attorney. You know, so, and then there's, I think, apocalyptic times. And I wanted to add that in there because the pandemic certainly has felt like apocalyptic times. And again, I want to honor anybody who's been a caregiver during these moments, that these are extraordinary. Your efforts have certainly been extraordinary. But during all of that time that's passing, I'm still holding my breath, right? You hold your breath because you wonder, is she going to get mad? Is she going to hit somebody? Are we going to have to move her? Is she going to swallow soap again? In which case she did not swallow soap again, but in this particular instance, she bit on a styrofoam Easter egg that she thought was probably just a candy, and her lips were swollen from the dye. So again, we had another emergency run there. But the kicking out never happens. And she becomes content with where she is, and I'm able to make a little bit of peace within myself, with the staff, with where she's at. And this takes time. This has taken a long period of time. Like I said, she was there for 6 years, and it took me a good 2 or 3 years before I could finally settle in. So I'm going to read a little bit that I hope might be inspiring to anybody who's struggling as a caregiver out there. By the time I had turned 40 and remarried, my mother was beginning to show signs of dementia. She couldn't write a letter like she did in college to advise me to be careful, be studious, and be good. For months after my father died, my attempts to care for my mother still centered on being good to achieve a desirable result. I was good if I made certain the nurses kept to my mother's bedtime rituals or her medications, or followed up with the podiatrist, or if I made sure her nails were painted, convinced her to attend watercolor crafts, or coerced her into playing the game Finish the Phrase by whispering the answer in her ear. If I did the right things, she would see me as being good. I was also trying to make up for my father's death, for anyone who didn't visit, because it was hard. It was hard, and it took an emotional toll on me and on my reservoir of courage. It took setting aside other aspects of my life. I did it anyhow because that's how I knew to be good. But it wasn't until I gave up on that perfection, because there was none to be had in my mother's dementia, that I saw her love for me. And I didn't have to be good all those years to earn that love. I don't think my mother had ever wanted me to be perfect in my behavior. Good simply became enough. Enough, my mother shouted in the middle of Mass when the chaplain bellowed forth the old rugged cross, or when a mumbling resident had gone on too long about the bird that had flitted away 20 minutes earlier. Enough, I said, walking out of her care home after my mother yelled at me for reading the newspaper to her. For 10 minutes, I sat and sobbed in my car. Later, I relayed the story to my husband and swore I wouldn't go back. Enough, I saw in my mother's eyes one day when I felt her touch was magic, as if she had waved a wand and filled me with all she had left. Enough, I felt, no longer needing to read her letters to understand what it meant to be good. So I hope you all keep that in mind. We don't have to be good because we're enough. And Natalie's jumping ahead of me. Natalie's already ahead of me. So here we are, moved on to the next slide, making peace, saying, knowing when you've been enough, and then finally saying no. And I'm going to read a little bit from this because I think this is another important aspect. So we talk about ordinary time and tragic and apocalyptic. The end of my mother's life came about from something that she had always loved to do, and that's to go outside. She was outside walking around the sidewalk one day, and someone else was coming in her direction, and I'm sure that she just stepped out of the way and fell. And she and another resident kind of tumbled over one of the other, and it happened to be my mom who landed on the concrete, and she broke her hip. At this point in time, she was 90 years old, and I had a decision to make. Hours ago, the x-ray had been read. My mother had sustained a hip fracture, serious enough to consider surgery if she were someone else, younger, more spry. I was vindicated in my earlier insistence that she should be released from the hospital, but in another sense, I was condemning her. I signed on for hospice care, for her comfort, instead of surgery for the fractured hip. It's not end of life care, I repeated guiltily to siblings and friends. There was a difference. In all the decisions I had to make, my mother's fall had made the decision, but not the follow through, easy for me. Would her life be shortened now that she had fallen? Perhaps not any more than if she hadn't. Would she be comfortable in the Cadillac of wheelchairs and hospital beds? Probably so. She was already napping plenty. Her body was worn down from being worn down. Finally, it was time for me to say no to more surgery or medical intervention. It was what I was best at doing. She was snoring now, making sounds like the jackhammer that was used during construction near my house. I was glad I wasn't there to hear it. The sunny weather would have brought all sorts of construction trucks to the street, and the noise would have driven me insane. My mother's room was near the television room, and Dorothy's voice in The Wizard of Oz streamed down the hallway. It was the scene where Dorothy first encountered the Wicked Witch of the West after Auntie Em's home landed on the witch's sister. Just try to stay out of my way, the witch said. I used to crouch behind the patchwork couch and watch the movie as a youngster, or wrap my skinny arms around my mother's belly and shut my eyes. I couldn't hide any longer. I had to face my mother and our future. She lay before me, sometimes gurgling with eyes closed, sometimes staring wide-eyed. She had not said much, but offered a few smiles and stroked my hair. I'm here, I reminded her out loud, and plastered my arms to her torso, unwilling to let go. We'll get through this together. My mother's ending, though not unique, was certainly special because all of our loved ones' deaths are special. And it fit for what was important to her so much that how it ended is actually contained in the subtitle of my book, What My Mother Taught Me About Dementia, Cookies, Music, the Outside, and Her Life Inside a Care Home. The book I wrote was a testimony to our time and our love, but also to staff and caregivers and anyone else that I came in contact with. There's still a lot of former staff members that I am in touch with, a lot of family members of residents that I got to know that I've managed to stay in touch with. And we all became a family. And as difficult as it might be for those of you that are considering your loved ones move into any sort of care home setting, um, another piece of advice I can offer to you is that you treat that in the same way you might treat, well, maybe not in the same way you might treat your family, but you know, you do what you would do in order to create a family-like atmosphere, and hopefully that is reciprocated. Next slide, Natalie. So the lessons that are contained in the book that I, want to impart with all of you here today, taking the time to be with them, be with your loved ones now, learn as much as you can about their life. Otherwise, you're left speculating a lot later on when they're unable to share more in your life and theirs. Um, I have regrets that I was all set to record a lot of stories between my dad and I, and we had a date and time all lined up, and he fell just several days before that, and we never had that opportunity again to set down on paper all of the stories that he used to share with me, and he was certainly the storyteller in our family. As for music and the outside, I always tell people to find out what's unique about your loved ones and connect into that. What's when I'm teaching writing workshops, I always talk to my participants and students about finding the through line in your work. Like, what are the essential questions that you're trying to answer in your work? And the same applies to caregiving as well too. What were the essential questions in your own loved ones' lives? What was essential to them? For my mom, it was family, and I knew that because she had imparted that upon us for all time. But I also knew it later on as I started piecing all of her stories back together from somebody whose um, birth father had died before she was born, and she only had a half brother, and she was surrounded by all these other Italians that have these big families, these big intact families. So for her, that sort of familial connection was always important, and so I tried to recreate that within the care home setting as well too. And regarding life inside a care home, well, I've talked about that, about the family like surroundings, but be observant, and not just of your own surroundings, but of the staff and and what they're going through, and also of the fragility of life. And then I always say, when all else fails, there's always cookies, because I could always bring in cookies to brighten up my Mother's Day. And I got to the point where there's a story in the book where I tell this, where every Friday I brought in cookies and shared them with residents down my mom's corridor. And it became so much of a ritual for me that it was like going to church. And I only stopped doing it once the pandemic hit and I could no longer make my way inside. Next slide, Natalie. So going back to, I mentioned some of the lessons that I carried forward with me from the death of my first husband. And I realized over time that I wish I would have given more love than I gave care. And that doesn't mean that I, that you can just let go of when they're supposed to get their insulin shots and what time they're supposed to get their medications. Um, but that we should let go of some of that and remember that there's this human person in front of you that needs you to be who you are, and not the nagging you at all times. And several of the other lessons, I have this wood carving up above my office that I wish I could put my laptop around so you could all see. And it was a gift from my husband. And one day he took several phrases that he had found on my blogs or in my books, and he had them etched into this wood carving. And one of the phrases, I'm going to read it off of the wood carving itself, that I wrote about my mom, as I started realizing that even though her memories were slipping away, she is becoming closer to the perfect state of being. And even though we feel like they're losing so much, they're gaining something. They're gaining on us in their humanness. And it's a place where we're all trying to get to. And as I said earlier, be enough. Um, be content that you are enough for your loved one, and know when to say no. And then finally, and I just threw this one in here because I just heard her say this on a podcast. So Elizabeth Gilbert, who's a very well-known author of Eat, Pray, Love, and several other books, she lost, hang on, she lost her partner to cancer right before the pandemic. And during the interview, again, you're always asked, what would you do different? And she said, if I had the chance to do it over again, could have done it differently. It would have been to walk into it in a stance of surrender. Arms collapsed, no clipboard, no agenda, no cherished outcome. And to have almost gone limp into it, which is not the same thing as hopelessness, but it is a very powerful stance to take in the wake of something that is bigger than you are. So I think that's a great way to sum up even some of the other lessons that I offered up earlier of, remember to give more love than care. And it's not always about the clipboard. Sometimes it's okay to leave the clipboard and the notebook alone and just be in the presence of those you love and are caring for. In closing, I just want to say thank you for listening to my talk today. I want to thank you, Natalie, again for the invite to be here. I have my book is on Kindle. It's available via an audio book, and you can visit my website, and there you'll find links to all sorts of my writing and my blogs. And if you have any questions, you're always welcome to ask any of them now, or please do feel free to send me an email. I'm always happy to help another person along. You can follow me on Twitter and Instagram and Facebook. And I would also note that because we have all learned these technologies, and Natalie and I have overcome the GoToWebinar technology today with some glitches that we have, but I have a colleague of mine and I that host caregiver writing experiences. So these are not like formal writing workshops. We have prompts, and then we read what we've written, and the prompts are usually related to some aspect of caregiving. And it's just another way to help people process what they're going through. So you can find that information is also available on my website. We do those once a quarter. I think the next one is coming up in February. And if you can't find the information, just email me. So thank you.